A great day. Let me jump right now, then right into introducing our first keynote speaker, and that is Stoic Dan. So he is going to be talking about Stoicism and the American Transcendentalists. I'm particularly looking forward to this talk as somebody who studies them myself. Stoic Dan is somebody who is, there's that old word, indefatigable, I think is how it's pronounced. The person who is, constantly exuding energy. And so Stoic Dan is one of those people. He has 5 meetups that he has started and is running for the purpose of, introducing people to philosophy. That's a lot of work. Just one meetup is already a lot of work. So I don't know quite how he does it. And these focus on Stoicism, minimalism, American Transcendentalism. I'm really looking forward to his talk. So Dan, if you wouldn't mind going off mute.
Okay, great. Thanks for that super introduction, Greg. I am Stoic Dan from Orlando. And today I'm talking about the linkages that we can find between the American Transcendentalists and the modern Stoicism movement today. The American Transcendentalists, for those of you who know your history, that's Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, and also Margaret Fuller. There was actually a broader group of people involved in that movement in the mid-1800s. And we're just going to talk about 3 of them briefly today, Emerson, Thoreau, and Fuller, and their ideas as well as their contributions. And one of the things, let's see, if Dan Hayes could allow me to share my screen, I'm going to start with Emerson. And he was obviously a philosopher, a poet, a lecturer. Not all of you may know that he was a Unitarian minister also. Emerson played a role in the Unitarian history. And he was a leading figure in the Transcendentalist movement. That's not just my opinion, that's also what most scholars agree. And let's see, here you can go. So his topics, his main topics that he wrote about in his essays and in his lectures of the time was that he wrote about individuality, virtue, freedom, and nonconformity. The first essay of his that caught my attention was called self-reliance. This is a word that comes up in many Stoic conversations today, but in his essay, which started as a sermon in 1830, one of his famous quotes from the self-reliance essay is he says, quote, "Trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, and the connection of events." Now, in this essay, some of his general themes are individualism, that is the moral worth of a person, and he also cautions readers to follow their own will rather than conforming to society and to the church at that time. The influences on this essay, Self-Reliance, was that he took a trip to Europe and had conversations with other great thinkers of the time, like Coleridge and Carlyle. And in terms of Stoicism, I think the theme from this essay that comes through is that he says the divine is in you. It's like what we talk of in Stoicism, that the spark of the universe is in each of us. And I think that translating that to today, conformity is a very important issue for today. We have the young people, young adults and kids who are inundated with social media and news and even violent video games and things like that. Are they going to conform to those things, or are they going to be more skeptical thinkers? The next essay that I'd like to briefly cover for Emerson is his essay called History. This came from a lecture in 1837. And he says there, quote, "There is one mind common to all individual men. Every man is an inlet to the same, and to all of the same. He that is once admitted to the right of reason is made a freeman. of the whole estate, who hath access to the universal mind, is a party to all that is or can be done, for this is the only and sovereign agent. Well, some of the key words that he's using there, like reason and a free person or a free man, is very close to the Stoic writings that talk about us using reason so that we have freedom from things like worry, stress, and anxiety. And sometimes I will criticize the internet, but I'll praise it for a moment. I'll say that if Emerson were alive today, he might be amazed at the power of the internet to connect minds and share knowledge. His next essay, very quickly, is called The Oversoul. This was first published in 1841. And there he says, quote, "The soul's advances are not made by gradation, such as can be represented by motion in a straight line, but rather the ascension of state, such as can be represented by metamorphosis, from the egg to the worm, from the worm to the fly." And in general, I think what he's describing here is not only his belief in God, but I think he's also saying that that academics could consider this as a more of a little bit on the mystical side, but he is describing about the role of God in our lives and that we can communicate with him without the help of the church. That was the important thing, is Emerson is trying to make us independent thinkers. All right, the next essay is called Woman. And here he's talking about the importance of women in society. This is something similar to how the ancient Stoics were described. They often, we often talk about them as being forward-thinking in terms of women and their role in society. Here, Emerson says, quote, "The part they play in education, in the care of the young, and the tuition of older children is their organic office in the world. So much sympathy as they have makes them inestimable as the mediators between those who have knowledge and those who want it." So he's saying in this essay, he's promoting the moral worth of women. And this would surface later, by the way, in Unitarian values, such as justice, human relations, and the world community. So I think Emerson was ahead of his time in terms of his esteem for women. Now, I've got two more brief essays to cover. One is called The American Scholar, which came from a lecture in 1837. And here he says, quote, "The first in time and the first in importance of the influences upon the mind is that of nature. Every day the sun, and after sunset, night and her stars. Ever the winds blow, ever the grass grows. There is never a beginning, there is never an end to the inexplicable continuity of this web of God, but always circular power returning into itself." Well, the scholars talk about this essay called The American Scholar, and they observe that Emerson is talking about actions and work, about in other words, our actions and our work in our lives. And it sounds a lot like Aristotle's writings in the Nicomachean Ethics, which defines ethics and excellence not by what we say, but what we repeatedly do. Now, the final essay for Emerson is what some people remember him most for. It's called the Divinity School Address. This lecture and sermon was given on an evening in July of 1838, and he was speaking to the graduating class of Harvard's Divinity School. We are told by the records that there were only about 100 people there that evening, and only 6 of them were graduates of the school. The rest of them were faculty and parents and friends, but boy, did they react to what he had to say. The quote that I've chosen for this one is, quote, "While the doors of the temple stand open night and day before every man, and the oracles of this truth cease never, it is guarded by one stern condition, this namely, it is an intuition. It cannot be received at second hand. Truly speaking, it is not instruction but provocation that I can receive from another soul. What he announces, I must find true in me or wholly reject, and on his word or as his second, Be he who he may, I can accept nothing. He's basically saying that he doesn't want to receive information secondhand, whether we're talking about the words of the Bible or the other instructions from the institution of the church. He's basically saying that we should be independent thinkers and we should be experiencing life firsthand. He also, as a result, he advises the graduates in that class, graduating class that evening. He wants them to be telling their own stories, in other words, finding their own message in life. And he doesn't want to just resort to the scriptures that are frozen in time. So he wants to make them more independent thinkers. All right, I'm going to take a sip here to drink. And next we're moving on to Henry David Thoreau. Well, first of all, for those of you who are interested in the pronunciation side of his name, remember that most of us, including scholars, call him Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, but his family actually produced or pronounced his name as Thorough. And that's an interesting bit of trivia there. But overall, he's self-described as a mystic, a transcendentalist, and a natural philosopher. And his writings covered society, the individual, and the search for universal laws. So I'm going to review quickly 3 essays here and then say something about his book, Walden. The first essay, for which he's probably most famous for, is called Civil Disobedience. This was published in 1849. And the quote here is, "The mass of men serve the state thus, not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies." And Thoreau is having a feeling here that people don't question government enough and should instead act on their own principles, even when this is against the law. It's also a reference to Rousseau and his social contract, which came about 100 years before. The questions there were, what government should we set up? And monarchs are not divinely empowered. But the important part here is for transcendence and the Transcendentalist movement is Thoreau wants us to have less government and more freedom. He also says that society, although it has its values, it is nonetheless a distraction. And so we should not always go with the herd, and we should be using our own moral compass. The next famous essay is called Slavery in Massachusetts. This was a lecture from 1854. And the quote that I'll start with here is, 3 years ago also, just a week after the authorities of Boston assembled to carry back a perfectly innocent man and one whom they knew to be innocent into slavery, the inhabitants of Concord caused the bells to be rung and the cannons to be fired to celebrate their own liberty. Well, what he's talking about here is he's talking about the Massachusetts law at that time, that although they did not have slaves in the state, they did, by law, return slaves who were fleeing the South. They would return them to their slave owners in the South. And this made Thoreau quite upset. He pointed out in the celebration mentioned in that quote, he points out the hypocrisy of celebrating one's own freedoms and yet sending people back into slavery. So the transcendent part of this essay is that we must recognize what is morally right, despite what laws there may be on the books. Okay, next essay is Walking, an essay called Walking. This comes from a lecture he gave in 1851. And here he says, quote, "I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, as contrasted with a freedom and culture merely civil, to regard man as an inhabitant or a part and parcel of nature, rather than a member of society. I wish to make an extreme statement. If so, I may make an emphatic one, for there is enough champions of civilization, the minister and the school committee, and every one of you will take care of that." Well, here he's explaining that part of nature, the part of the wildness that we need to explore. And he believed very firmly that when we do explore nature, that we rediscover our true selves. The transcendent part of this is the modern author, Richard Schneider. His bio says that Thoreau is looking for absolute freedom, not civil liberty. And Thoreau's wildness is opposite of city and culture. So this is finding our other selves, in other words. Now, of course, for those of you who've studied Stoicism for a while, you'll realize that the ancient Stoic writings often talk of living according to nature. And although I don't think that's exactly what Thoreau is discussing here, but I do think that Thoreau and Emerson may have been inspired by those words that were often repeated, living according to nature. I think that could have been an influence on them. Finally, we come to Thoreau's book called Walden from 1854. This was, in many ways, his own personal story or declaration of his, well, the subtitle of the book used to be called Life in the Woods. And most of us who've read about this, we know that he did live in the woods for 2 years and 2 months. But it's also important to recognize the history that he did often go back to Emerson's house, which was just a couple miles away. So that's not often or not described too much in the history, but it is a fact. The important part of Walden is that he moved there in 1845, and he was working on another book at the time. But he found in living at Walden, he found that he could sustain himself by cultivating the land and working occasionally as a surveyor and a carpenter, and that's how he earned his living. Chapter 2 of the book Walden starts with the famous line, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately." And I often pick out this line because Thoreau is using words like deliberately and later in the quote, essential. He's talking about things that today are very important to the minimalist movement, which has a lot of connections to Stoicism as well, to live simply, or in Stoicism, as we say, if we can live with less, then we'll be rich indeed. Well, the book Walden is also popular because it's part storytelling and complex metaphors. And if you haven't read it yet, it's certainly relevant for modern times. The Stanford Encyclopedia describes the book as saying, "It almost defies categorization. It is a work of narrative prose which often soars to poetic heights, combining philosophical speculation with close observation of a concrete place. It is a rousing summons to an examined life and the realization of one's potential." Well, I hope you will take a look at Walden of any of the essays or books that I've mentioned. I think it really is an important book for modern times because in that book, Thoreau is showing us how he can practice a simple living. He can also be okay with solitude and of course, self-reliance. He's very self-reliant in this book. He grew his own food. And so in so doing, I think that he's understanding reality a little bit better and finding wisdom. He wasn't just talking about the philosophy for just an abstract sense. He really wanted to make it a lived philosophy as we talk about for Stoicism. Okay, well, I want to wrap up now so we have time for Q&A. The next person that I want to talk about is Margaret Fuller. I've included her here because although she's not discussed enough in the in the American Transcendentalism movement, I do include her because one of my areas of study is women in philosophy. And Margaret Fuller was the author of 5 books and 350 essays at the time that she lived. In her career, she was actually a journalist and a critic, but she was noted as a great philosopher of her times. The themes are that we in society are burdened by selfish desires. That sounds like a very Stoic thing to say. And we're also on the verge of a spiritual awakening. She became the editor of the Dial magazine, which was the official magazine of the American Transcendentalist movement. And she became editor of it in 1840. This is actually what you see here on the screen, I believe, is one of the first edition copies that were published. So that's the fascinating thing about the internet, is we can retrieve those things. But also, let me go to the next slide here. She also published a famous book called Woman in the 19th Century. And notice that the title is not Women of the 19th Century, but Woman in the 19th Century. And she's taking a closer look at the role of women in society and even in philosophy. All right, well, that brings me to the end of this presentation. Overall, I think you'll find, if you do some Googling, you'll find that the American Transcendentalist movement started about 1830, went to 1860. It's a relatively short period, like 30 years. I believe that these people from the Transcendentalist movement held high very much the value of reason and intellect. There are lots of direct matches to Stoic writings there. And they were also very much for for personal freedoms. They wanted to learn things firsthand. They didn't want to just take the word of others. I know this is something that, this sentiment is very important today, because when we talk about bringing philosophy into the modern age, I think that skepticism of the American Transcendentalist movement is very helpful today, not just in terms of our views of society, but also of the internet. There's a lot of things we can read on the internet that we should be aware of. Let's see, how can I wrap this up? I think that overall, that theme of self-reliance is something that we can learn from this American Transcendentalist movement and bring into the present. And now we're going to have time for Q&A. I thank you for your attention so far. Gregory, how would you like to handle the Q&A?
I'll read the questions out loud to you as people bring them in. So I've actually got one for you that piggybacks off of what you were just saying about the need to be self-reliant and sort of experiment, figure out for oneself. It strikes me that one of the things that makes modern Stoicism is exactly that, instead of just like saying, well, Seneca said this, so it must be true, you try to apply it, and then you see what things work and what things don't work. And maybe that might lead to saying some things aren't very helpful and we can put them to the side, but some things are incredibly helpful and we want to keep doing more of those. So do you see that as a interconnection between Stoicism as a way of living a philosophical life and Transcendentalism?
Yes, I do. Actually, what your comment or question reminds me of is that think of how many times today in modern Stoicism we talk about dealing with discomfort, putting ourselves through a little test, like, oh, I can do without air conditioning, or I can do without my car this weekend. Well, consider what Thoreau did. He went and lived in the woods mostly for 2 years and 2 months and was self-sufficient. He would grow most of his own food, and he would, in his journal in Walden, what's really fascinating to me is he sometimes writes his budget out in pennies, so many pennies to buy beans for this and to plant them in the field. And he talks about farming them. He really put himself through a form of discomfort, but of course to him, it was actually preferable. He wanted to be in nature. So he saw it from both sides there.
So this is a good question coming from Timothy, right about exactly that. What truth or truths did Thoreau gain from his living in nature?
Right. This is an area that not only did he find a way to grow his own food and live on very simple means, but much like Stoicism, sometimes we talk about talk about Seneca and Marcus Aurelius as being so wealthy, and yet they talk about simple living. Well, that same criticism or controversy might be applied to Thoreau, because we do know from the history that he did go back to Emerson's house sometimes when he needed clothes washed or to have dinner with the Emersons. So there is a little bit of controversy there, but essentially I believe he did live in the woods for long periods and was self-sufficient.
So here's two things, both from the New England Stoics. Happy to have them represented here. Peter Fagella says, not a question, but here in New England, you can visit Walden Pond and the houses of Thoreau and Emerson. And then Mark Deshays says, if you were to recommend one place to start, which of the sources would a person start with to learn more about these three thinkers? Emerson's Self-Reliance, Walden, Walking. So that's a good question there.
Yeah, I would start with Self-Reliance. It's a short essay and very meaningful. I mean, it seems like every paragraph in there is quotable, but Self-Reliance is a great place to start.
So here's a question from Nick. I've been intrigued by Thoreau for some time. I've never thought of him as having a Stoic view. Does he ever mention Stoic teachings specifically? Do you think his writing also indicates influence from other schools of thought? If so, which ones?
Yeah, that's a very important question. It's not just uh, imp, the it's not just a conclusion that scholars have formed that they followed Stoics or they read about the Stoics. It's actually mentioned in their journals that they were well read, and that did include the ancient writings of the Stoics. So we know for certain that the Stoics were an influence on the American Transcendentalists.
Oh, here's another really useful one from Sean. My impression of transcendentalism is a lot of emphasis on contemplation. What I mean by that is not exactly thought, but an awareness beyond thought. Does that make sense? And Stoicism thought is so all important. Is there a component of Stoicism that involves that kind of contemplation?
Contemplation, yes. Well, it's one of the themes that runs through these writers, Emerson, Thoreau, and Fuller, is they are focusing on the individual to develop themselves. Um, I mean, this is, of course, where the name transcendentalism comes from, is you are transcending, you are growing as an individual, or you are having spiritual growth, as another phrase might say it. And so that development of the individual is not only important for the individual to have a better view or perspective of the world, but also there's another essay, American Scholar, where the message is that you should not only develop yourself, but you might contribute back to the community. You might be the next great thinker or writer, as they say in American Scholar, where you can really bring a positive impact on society. And therein is a link to the cosmopolis, the modern Stoic term that we're using a lot now.
So that is a perfect segue into the next question. This is from Mark. I discovered Thoreau through anarchism, though I wouldn't consider him one. However, he does seem to present something of a cosmopolitan perspective. Is that a correct assessment? Could you please say a bit on that?
Yeah, I would say that Thoreau would have mixed views about that. When I started reading Thoreau, I had a view that he was just anti-society, that he wanted to stay away from it, he wanted to live in the woods. But as you read more, you'll see that he does value some things that society offers. You know, for example, in town, there's people are growing food and bringing that to market. A lot of things are happening there that if you had to do it all by yourself, it would be a lot of work. Clothing, all different textiles, things they had even back then in the mid 1800s. He did value those things, but he also cautioned people that if you go with the herd completely and you are just believing everything society tells you, then you're missing a lot. And he wanted us to be more of a free thinker. In terms of cosmopolitanism, I think that Thoreau did have a great interest in learning from people. For example, in Walden, he talks about several evenings, several conversations he had with neighbors, with people who were passing through, and he really enjoyed that enough, that conversation. He enjoyed it enough to share it in the book. But I think that he might also be a little bit fearful going to town. He might shy away from that. So he was a mixture of ideas.
Here is a question from Timothy. How does Buddhism or mindfulness tie into these writers?
Ah, that's a good question. I don't compare them much to Buddhism, but in terms of the mindfulness, I think that when you just start in the first couple of chapters of Walden, I could argue that he's being very mindful. You'll see him listing in his book his grocery list. You know, that he went to the store and he bought some beans, and he will talk about how he spent $2.03 on it. He's very much in the moment. He's very much focused on his grocery list because he knows that those beans are going to be brought home to the cabin. He's going to plant them in the field, and when they grow and he's going to harvest them, that's going to be his food for the winter, perhaps. So I think he is very mindful in that respect, for sure.
So while we're waiting for some other questions to come through the text, I'll ask. You've mentioned this sort of needing to free oneself of conventions. Would that make Thoreau and Emerson and Fuller more like cynics than the Stoics, or do you see them as still pretty compatible?
Well, that's a good observation. The cynics were very cynical about society, and Thoreau and Emerson certainly had that aspect to their writings. I think that more research would be interesting in this topic, because if we look back to why the cynics were anti-society, you know, I remember they walked in the streets, they were homeless, they didn't go by social conventions. Thoreau and Emerson were somewhat social, but I think that they also valued the wildness or the wilderness very much like some of their contemporaries at the time. You know, Whitman also wrote about the value of nature. And I think so. I think that, so to answer your question, I think they were their own flavor of cynics. They had big questions about society.
All right, so there's two questions here actually about Thoreau's civil disobedience. Let's take the more broad one first, then we'll come back to Doug's in a minute. For this is from Mark. Do you see any Stoic influences in Thoreau's civil disobedience?
Stoic influence in civil disobedience. Well, in my mind, I'm connecting the idea of what Thoreau was telling us is that if the laws that society give us are immoral, that we should protest them and we should work against them. And of course, Thoreau is also famous for ending up in jail for not paying his taxes. But that was his way of protesting in a way. I also think that I'm also going back in my mind that I think there's a quote by Marcus Aurelius that says that if I have to choose between the Roman law and the higher laws, that I will choose the latter. I'm probably paraphrasing Marcus Aurelius there, but it's the same concept, is that if there is a law that's immoral, that we need to protest.
So that's actually a good lead-in to Doug's about Thoreau's civil disobedience. How would you compare that to Stoic views on the duty of the individual in society? I think some people, just to piggyback off of that, might view Stoicism as saying, well, you should be a conformist, you don't rock the boat, stick to your little place and don't cause any issues. But that's not really the Stoic view, right?
Correct. In fact, I remember one of my favorite quotes about this is by Massimo, where he talks about that in a recent talk in the pandemic. Massimo was saying that Stoics are not passive. We have to remember that we are active in every aspect of our lives. And though we may seem to be sitting there passively, but actually what we're doing is we're thinking about, what am I going to say next? What am I going to do next? So we are employing reason in that regard. And of course, when Thoreau wrote Civil Disobedience, there were a lot of things going on at the time in American culture. He was very much against slavery, and he didn't just talk about it or lecture about it. He did participate in the underground slave, I forget what that was called, the movement to get slaves out of the South.
The
And,
railroad, yeah.
the railroad, right.
You know, so I'm going to read Dan's in just a moment, but that reminds me of something. When I needed to get civil disobedience because I was teaching it in class, so I got a library copy. And in there's a really interesting essay where he is praising John Brown after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And a lot of people in the North were even condemning John Brown, basically saying, well, we agree with his sentiments, we're against slavery, but you can't engage in armed insurrection. And Thoreau praises him. So I'm going to ask you this: do you think is he self-contradictory in praising John Brown for what he's engaging in, or is this a matter of following principle?
Yeah, this is a difficult subject for American Transcendentalists, but I must admit that Thoreau was praising someone that I think Thoreau had mixed feelings about. I think later in his journals, he has some comments that he didn't like what John Brown was doing, of course, because there was a lot of violence and death there. I think that basically what happened is both Thoreau and Emerson were praising John Brown in one aspect for not accepting the way things are, but they also had reservations about the violence that he used. So they had mixed feelings, but of course, the essays and the writings that have come down through history, we can cherry pick just one side and say, well, he supported him, but I think there was a mixed feeling there. Also, for those of you who are, I forget, I think it's on HBO or Showtime, there's actually a series on John Brown that is playing weekly on Sundays right now. And I think Ethan Hawke is the actor who plays the lead role. So that's one way you can get involved with modern philosophy, is looking back on that history.
Well, that's nice, because it's so rare that you get philosophy in popular culture in that way. So here's a question from Dan Hayes. What have you gained personally from your study of the Transcendentalists, and how have you implemented that in your day-to-day life? Are there any practices that come directly from them?
Yeah, it's I enjoy nature very much also. And so I do. In this pandemic, I've been walking a lot in parks. And sometimes I just sit in a park, where they have a convenient bench, and I'll just look at the sky and the trees. A real appreciation for nature, and it's something that I've always done through my life, but now I make it a regular practice. And I find that in this pandemic, when often we're stuck at home a lot or more than we would like, going out to a park, even a park that is empty. Sometimes there are parks you may find in your area that have very few people at, but still you can enjoy the park for its nature.
Well, that's interesting. Is it possible to combine that with as the Stoics teach us, our social communal nature, by socially distancing walks in parks or things like that?
Yes, the Orlando Stoics started years ago with one walk per month. It was on, I think, the second or third Sunday, but over time it got more popular. And then we had it on every Sunday, and best of all, the members actually suggested different parks in Orlando that were extremely beautiful. We have a park near Princeton Street. It's called Lockhaven Park. And it's got such old trees and interesting landscaping and an irregular shaped lake that we can walk around. There's also part of the trip is a boardwalk, part of it is sidewalks. It's such a beautiful area. And of course, we're in the rainy season now, where it rains every afternoon. So we had to put a little hiatus on the walks. But the Orlando Stoics did practice walking meditations every Sunday, and we're going to get back to it also.
This might actually be a good time for Dan Hayes to just say a little bit about experimenting with exactly that same thing up here in Milwaukee. Obviously, you can't do it year round like you can in Orlando, but
So I came to it from my time when I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I was hanging out with the Fremont Stoics, and we went to Lake Elizabeth, and we walked around there weekly. And so I tried to take that and bring it back with me when I moved back here to Milwaukee, in order to try to recreate this experience of interacting with nature and then interacting with some of the Stoic teachings, as well as building community.
Great. And also, I'll add one thing I found that I didn't expect to find, but in the walking meditations that we have in Orlando, the people who come there tend to be not the ones who come to the formal discussions. And it's because they just want to talk about, they don't want to have an agenda or anything planned out like I usually do in my outlines, but they want to just have a free-form discussion, maybe about Stoicism or philosophy in general, maybe other topics. Maybe they just want to ask me, hey, I'm getting interested in Stoicism. What can you tell me about it to get me started? So it's very important, I think, for our group that the walking meditations are a non-structured format that gives people the freedom to cover a lot of what they want to talk about.
that's actually a good point that I think maybe we'll take up a little bit more in the panel towards the end of the day, talking about like what sort of formats and whether it's better to have one or several different kinds of events throughout the month for Stoic meetups.
Great.
Any other last questions for Dan while we've got him here to tap his mind about Stoicism and the Transcendentalists? We'll give it just a minute, and if we don't have any, then we'll sign off a little bit early. We're going to have a brief break, and then we'll be bringing up our second speaker, Meredith Kuntz, who will be talking about a quick start guide to Stoic parenting. I'll do an introduction of her at that time. Doesn't look like we have any other questions. So if I had a applause and clapping sound thing handy, I'd be playing that right now, but people can weigh in and chat if they want to. Thanks very much for coming and giving this talk.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.